So, welcome to the Kerouac House for Sarah's final reading. I know Jana's a lot better looking than me, but she is on her way back from Hawaii. She just left Kona just shortly. A little while ago, she's been teaching writing out there a week. So you're going to have to put up with me. So we're glad you're here. And for those of you who have never been here before, welcome. And feel free afterwards. There's a few board members here. I'm a director of the residency, and John's on our board, and Karen at the back, and Eric. So any of us will be happy to show you around, see the place, parts of the house where Jack lived, and that's what else. So Sarah is leaving us this week, and then we'll be there's a week between residents, and on the Friday the 31st, Eric, by the way, was a resident. You were here in 2016, and we chose him because he really wrote this interesting first chapter for a novel, which Eric has finished and is now published. And tell him what's going to happen on the Friday the 31st.
We're doing a book launch party here on Friday. We will have drinks and light hors d'oeuvres. There will be a reading, and I will be signing copies.
All right. And what's the book called now?
Mackinac Island Nation.
Yes, and you should get it. It's great. Eric's a great writer, and so we're so glad that his book's out, and we can welcome him for a book release party. And then our next resident her name is Deidre Coyle, and she will be arriving, I think, on the 2nd or the 3rd. I probably should check because I got to pick her up from the airport. And so then on the 8th, Saturday the 8th of June. My gosh, June. We will be having a welcome potluck here for her at 7:30. Right here. Bring a plate to share with others, and because the potluck, and we a plate with food on. Yeah, I'm just. And it better be damn good food. And we share and get to know and meet our new resident and welcome them to the Kerouac House. And so feel free to come, but that'll be at 7:30. And if you don't come quick, you won't miss out. But so you're welcome to be here for that. And then I need to check the date on that one. I believe. Yeah, on come back here, 22nd. It's going to be another event here at the Kerouac House on Saturday the 22nd with Black Cow Jumps. And some of you will know Banks Hennepin, who comes to some of our things. He and his group are going to be performing here. And I don't have a whole lot of information, and but Banks is at the Fringe right now, so he's really busy. But soon we'll put up an announcement on that on our Facebook page. All the bank says it's going to be a lot of fun, and there'll be lots of alcohol. So what more would Jack Kerouac want in his house? So mark your calendars on that, and like I say, it'll be up on the our Facebook page real soon. So we're here because our resident is leaving us shortly. It's the time just goes so fast, and all the residents say the same thing. It's like it seems like you've got forever here during that first month, and then it starts to ramp up until suddenly you're like, oh my God, it's almost over. And so we're here. Sarah's been a great resident. She has been very, very industrious. She has worked here and writing away. She was just telling me when I arrived, she said, counting up, she thinks she's written about 200 pages for her next book. So that's pretty productive. That's pretty good. So Sarah has moved down here, or came down here from Brooklyn, and you're going back to the Midwest from here, not back to, yes. So, and Sarah you have an MFA from NYU. And some of you may not realize that she was getting her MFA at the same time John was, and that was just one class or two classes or something that you had together. One. Okay, it was one. I'd stretch it as far as you can go. Yeah. So And I had no idea when we chose her that was the case, just in case you thought there was any inside stuff going on. So she's here. Her book, what's your book's name? Better Times was published last September by the University of Nebraska Press. It's a really great book. She's a wonderful short story writer, and so you should check it out. You can buy it on Amazon, I know that for sure, and read it. But without any further ado, I shall have Sara come and read to us. Better not.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you guys for coming tonight. Yes, as Jeff said, it's been very productive. What is it, 8-9 weeks, I guess, that I've been here. So yeah, I decided to take the opportunity while I was here to start a novel. And as Jeff said, got about 200 pages into a first draft. So I'm going to take a leap of faith and read from that. It's not very polished, so please be forgiving. So about 3 or 4 years ago now, I read an article in the New Yorker about I guess you would call them a protest group. They called themselves Plowshares. And they are a group of people who would break into Minutemen facilities, other nuclear facilities throughout the United States. And all they would do is use blood to write on like bombers. And they were totally peaceful. They didn't do anything to hurt anyone. They were made up mostly of priests and nuns. So that was pretty interesting. Their most recent, I believe, I guess it's possible they've done something since, but I don't know, was in 2012 when they broke into the Y-12 facility in Tennessee. So I read about this, and I thought it was pretty interesting. But, of course, me being who I am as a writer, I decided to not make it about a group of men, but about a group of young women. So I am going to read first the prologue and then some of one of the first chapters of the book. So here we go. We chose new names and went into the forest, not because we wished to live deliberately. We had seen the future, and there didn't seem to be much point to deliberation or living, at least as we had done so far. It had been an angry year. To the west, forest fires scorched new maps into the earth. To the east and south, hurricanes threw themselves onto merciless coasts. In between, tornadoes lifted whole homes into the heavens, and all around us floodwaters threatened to turn nations into Noahs without arks. Our widening gyre was a glob of plastic trash floating somewhere in the Pacific, which was warmer than it should be. Animals were becoming confused. Then they were becoming extinct, and nothing was being done about it. Men in expensive suits argued over the science while their phallic smokestacks pumped more junk into the sky, making many of these men rich. They yearned for possession, but their love was false, or at least conditional. Politicians threatened hostile territories with fire and fury, but it was already here. We were told we weren't seeing what was right before our eyes. Meanwhile, Antarctica could not keep hold of its ice. Come hell or high water, so the saying goes, we got both. We had to become our own sandbags against the rising tide. Picture this. 4 of us in a black hatchback climbing its way through the hills of Tennessee. We've been driving for 30 hours straight, stopping for bathroom breaks, but not to eat or sleep. None of us could do either of those things anyway. We have barely even spoken, and when we do, never above a whisper. The live wire energy inside us is only enhanced by the CD of Vivaldi concertos that Sister Kitty keeps putting on repeat. Sister Kitty chose her new name when the rest of us were just children. She is behind the wheel and has been since we left Montana. In the front passenger seat sits Cassandra, who was not heard. In the back behind her is India, who is the other kind of Indian. Beside her is Isla, who found herself alone. All 3 of us are under 21 years old and might not get much older. Or at least we won't get much older out here if everything goes according to plan. It's quiet tonight. Sister Kitty has told us not to roll down the windows, but still, it's a quiet we feel as much as hear. The moon is a little bent sliver in the sky. The trees, fibrous and black, gather conspiratorially, murmuring with the wind. We haven't passed another car for at least 3 hours. We race our headlights toward the dawn. What are we thinking in these moments? Of our parents, those of us that have them. Our brothers or sisters, if we have those. Our children, actual or hypothetical. Are we fearful? It would be only natural. Are we apprehensive, second-guessing, entertaining sabotage? Or are we steadfast, righteous, maybe even a little excited by the task ahead of us? We are not a monolith. We are all of these things at once. Our heartbeats sound in our ears like speed bumps. We're all dressed in black head to toe, even Sister Kitty, though she won't be coming with us. We had considered concealing ourselves in other ways. Pantyhose, plastic replicas of presidents. India suggested wearing masks with human faces on the backs of our heads, like hunters did in the Sri Lankan jungles to scare off tigers attacking from behind. But that seemed unnecessary. And besides, no matter what direction they came from, we wanted whoever found us to see our true selves. We wanted to register their surprise. It is 3 o'clock in the morning when we reach the town. Everything in it is crouched low to the ground. Everything except the church spire, a thin white spindle pinning the sky above in place. We pull into the empty parking lot. Sister Kitty kills the engine. For a moment, none of us moves. We hardly even dare to breathe. The world around us takes no notice. It does not muffle the sound of the opened car doors. It does not shrink around us as we pull our backpacks and flashlights from the trunk. It does not join with Sister Kitty to embrace us one final time. My girls, she says. They may be the last kind words we hear. The trees offer the dirt path to us almost grudgingly. We pick our way through carefully, single file, branches snapping at our feet. Leaf piles shudder and roll over like restless sleepers. Our own faces already like ghosts to one another. The forest falls away suddenly, opening up to a meadow. We half expect to see some wildlife, might even take such a sighting as a good omen, but there is nothing. That we can see at least. Only the silhouette of the steep ridge we still have left to climb. On the other side, our destination, the Y-12 National Security Complex. Home sweet home to 900,000 pounds of weapons-grade uranium. Now that we've come this far, we move toward it without much thought at all. Like sailors desperate for land, cast out in an ever-growing sea. It won't be much longer now. 1 year of work has come to this. And when you ask us, how could you do it? Well, our silence will echo that very same question back to you. Okay, so that's the prologue to entice you further. The way I've structured the book so far, the section that follows that is made up of, I call them intake interviews that Sister Kitty is giving to each of the 3 girls. But when I was going through it, they read kind of awkwardly aloud, so I decided to take the first chapter that's in the second part and read some of that to you. So I don't think there's anything you really need to know. If there's stuff you don't get, it'll be explained later. This is called Absortion. The girls did not arrive together, but Sister Kitty took note of each of them in turn. After almost a decade at the facility, she knew what to look out for. It had been her idea, the intake interviews. A lot of things had been her idea, come to think of it. The Monroes were a money family, which had its benefits, and was necessary to a certain extent. But they knew they were not an idea family, and blessed them for it. Not all wealthy Americans can recognize and acknowledge something like that about themselves. But the systems that were in place when Sister Kitty stepped in were a mess because of it. Papers shoved haphazardly in files arranged on the whims of people no longer around to explain them. Room assignments were tracked on peeling Post-its. The calendar was missing pages. It would not do. Since there was nobody to tell her otherwise, Sister Kitty's first order of business, as the new facilities coordinator of the Merry Widow Auxiliary House, was to find the place for everything and put it there. Her second was to find everything that didn't have a place yet and make one. That included the girls. At first, the interviews had just been a way to keep track of who was who. The previous coordinator had left no list of current residents, and her contact at the Monroe Foundation was little more help. A harried and sincere recent college graduate whose idealistic faith in the power of nonprofits to enact sweeping social change seeped further away with every call Sister Kitty made to her. "I'm so sorry," she said, "but the Monroes are concentrating on gay marriage reform this year. Do you think you can handle it on your own?" Sister Kitty had to laugh at that. She was 67 years old. The things she'd handled on her own stretched out on the line between them, threatening to break it. So she set to work. The Merry Widow Auxiliary House was created in 1999 by the Monroe family, after the owner of the nearby Merry Widow Health Mine dropped dead from a heart attack, the one ailment its specially calibrated vapors couldn't cure. The Monroe family had been going to the health mine for decades, practically since it first opened in 1952, and feared what would happen to it with the caretaker gone. Where else could Mother Constance take in the radon air that had extended her life far beyond the 6 months the doctors gave her when her liver failed? It had become their annual sojourn, sons, daughters-in-law, grandchildren all joining in for their recommended 32 one-hour visits each year. They could not risk it. They invested a considerable portion of the foundation's funds in building housing where year-round staff could stay and tend to the spa and its febrile clientele, with a set number of rooms set aside for girls in need, one of Constance Monroe's favorite amorphous pet causes. Thus it became Sister Kitty's job to look after the people who looked after the patients. Both the spa and the auxiliary facility were just outside Basin, Montana. It wasn't the sort of place you would visit accidentally. The last available census listed a population of 255. It was best appreciated from above, nestled in the plates of a narrow canyon and 10 miles from the Continental Divide, the land unfolding like welcoming arms to the plains that chose to make it their destination. The buildings in the town proper were skeletal, the residents moving about with the knock-kneed tentativeness of newborn calves. In summers, the heat at its predatory height, the air clutched at you the moment you stepped into it. Winters, the wind screamed until the snow came along to smother it. Neither the patients nor the staff of Merry Widow spent much time anywhere else. Not everyone who came seeking the cure was rich, of course, but the resentment of the town's citizens was egalitarian in that regard. The first thing Sister Kitty noticed about the staff when she arrived at Merry Widow was how they shook hands. Every last one of them, no matter their age or sex, would extend their right palm and then, once they had you, lean in and clutch your elbow with their left, like a mortician. Someone accustomed to greeting people in the grips of grief. Sister Kitty appreciated this. She thought it was a nice touch, how it equalized every man and woman, whether they were here for their asthma or migraines, their blood bulging with diabetes, their hair or bald heads swept up in silk scarves. All of them would come to glow with a kindred knowledge soon enough. No need to single anyone out as more or less sick than the rest. She still remembered the first sight of these patients rising in the morning for their treatment. All of them were dressed in white robes, billowing shrouds that looked to her eyes like parishioners awaiting a baptismal dunk in a river. She recognized this wish for renewal in something beyond the body, which was always breaking and betraying you. She hadn't been in the mines herself, but she could imagine the comfort these people felt, breathing in the chemically complicated air and feeling it thread through their veins, stitching them back up, even if she personally suspected the palliative benefits were more mental than physical. She watched from her office window as they walked together through a desert stretching endlessly in every direction. The dirt suntanned and silty, a lying great Goliath that might one day stand up and walk off with them all. The mines they approached were innocuous in comparison. Sturdy wooden frames wedged into the sides of rocky hills, the sheltered darkness yawning like a row of bored schoolboys. They loitered around these entrances, massaging one another's shoulders or merely standing in silent contemplation, until some unknown signal bid them to start filing in, each one pausing on the threshold to breathe into a radon counter, testing their levels. Anyone above 0 was turned away. Couldn't take any chances there. They were tested on the way out, too, to see how much they'd absorbed. This was usually the only interaction that Sister Kitty had with the guests, which is to say through glass and from a distance. They stayed in a hotel kept under separate management, and she was grateful for this. There was only so much attention she could give, and she preferred to bestow as much as possible on her girls. There were 12 staff members and 7 residents designated as in need when she arrived. Sister Kitty worked this all out herself by calling them into her office one-on-one. Furnished with a large oak desk, 2 chairs, and an intimidating oil portrait of Constance Monroe in the mine's signature white garb and striking a contradictorily regal pose, it was not an especially welcoming place to conduct interviews, but the grounds did not offer many other options. Aside from the mess hall, kitchen, and a rec room intended for silent meditation, the auxiliary facility was mostly made up of dormitories. Male and female staff roomed separately, as did the girls in need. It was all a very prophylactic arrangement, which again was fine by Sister Kitty. For a place so consumed with the idea of self-cleansing, it seemed only appropriate. As a nun operating in a secular environment, she didn't punish fraternizing, but she certainly didn't encourage it. And as an orphan, raised in the Society of the Holy Child Jesus, she was a scrupulous record keeper when it came to where all these young women had come from. She'd stumbled into the first question, really. The post-its she managed to salvage listed names and room numbers, so once she figured out who and where, she could move on to the why. The staff members she dismissed fairly quickly. It was of little concern to her why they'd sought employment here, and few of them seemed to stray from the dreamy yogic poses of personality that were generally attracted to such dubious methods of medicinal pursuit. But the other girls were different, required a more delicate touch. Sister Kitty well understood the pain that came from someone else presuming to tell your own story, even if the facts they offered were technically correct. She found that most of them were greedy for talk, and those who weren't could usually be persuaded with a little careful prodding, avoiding the tender spots until they were ready to reveal them. There were the recovering addicts, like Kiko and Wanda, who needed a few extra months to dry out after their court-mandated 28 days. And the ones seeking refuge from violence and abuse, like Drea and Farida. The latter was fleeing a brother who threatened to murder her after she got an abortion. There were even some fellow orphans, like Grace and Ruth Ann. Leslie had just been taken off suicide watch. She showed Sister Kitty the tick-marked scars on her upper thigh, one for every person in school who told her to kill herself. When Sister Kitty said it didn't seem like so many, certainly not enough that she should ever have listened to them, Leslie showed her the other leg. She'd broadcasted her attempt on Facebook. That she'd failed was her greatest embarrassment. Her years in the sisterhood instilled in her the strong belief that all most people in the world were seeking was a sense that what they were doing was purposeful. It could be the simplest thing. Indeed, it was most touching when it was the simplest thing. It caused her great anguish to walk through the halls and see the girls lounging aimlessly on their beds, flipping absently through a mass market paperback another resident left behind in the meditation room, or napping on the floor of that same room. Surely this wasn't what the Monroes had envisioned for them when they had been accepted into the facility. She saw how the staff sneered at their perceived laziness, talked to one another behind their hands, and smiled at them through their teeth. This all seemed like little more than misplaced jealousy to Sister Kitty's eyes, but such a dismissal didn't wipe the looks from their faces. Instituting a volunteer program did, though. The key, she found, was allowing the girls to choose what it was they wanted to do. Kiko, for instance, was eager to put the same meticulous attention, once reserved for shooting heroin into the webbing of her feet, to creating elaborate Japanese meals in the kitchen. Drea enjoyed the uncomplicated quiet of gathering bedsheets while the hotel guests were out in the mines. Ruth Ann led a Bible study, whose attendance was small but enthusiastic. Leslie did pirouettes down the hallways as she mopped them. Soon they, too, were glowing with the release of something that had been inside them all along. None of this had been required of Sister Kitty when she took the position. The Monroes had simply been happy to employ someone of such upstanding moral caliber, as they'd put it. And she'd been happy that their definition of upstanding moral caliber was flexible about serving prison time. Following her most recent release, and on the advice of her fellow Wooden Shoes cohort, she decided now was the time to lay low, reflect, and earn back some of the money she'd lost on their most recent venture. She agreed, in part because she was tired. After a combined 49 years of service, first to God and then to Mother Earth, she was ready to serve herself for a while. Her parole officers at Muncie had been reluctant to allow her to move out of state, but the Monroe family must have greased their wheels with some serious green, because 2 weeks later, here she was. She still had to provide proof of employment and do a weekly phone call to an office in Billings, but otherwise she was mostly left on her own. Nobody on staff seemed to know of her background, and certainly none of the girls did. She kept a small apartment of a pawn shop in Basin, tried to ignore its stale smell of cigarettes, the cold that slipped its fingers through the window seams, the wooden replica of an Indian chief that stood guard downstairs, over the things that nobody wanted anymore. She came home late most nights. She didn't like to leave until the girls had eaten and were in their rooms. Sometimes she'd get to talking with one of the staff members out at their monthly bonfires. She became very skilled at steering conversations away from herself, and it all worked for her, for a time at least. But she began to grow restless. During her 3rd year on the job, she began to use the tape recorder. She had recently turned 70, and while she was, in all the important ways, healthy, arthritis had begun to wind its hazardous ribbons through her. She lagged behind her girl's words like an amateur marathoner. Interviews that should have taken 2 days stretched out to a week. They grew annoyed at having to repeat themselves and began to withhold things from her instead. The idea had not been her own, however, but a willowy girl named Joanna's. Joanna was 19 and a recovering bulimic. Her body had the same translucent quality of fish that lived in the deepest parts of the ocean. Sister Kitty's greatest wish was to be able to embrace her, but she feared what it might do to her. It seemed unbelievable that the girl could even create enough energy to locomote anywhere, but somehow she did. Joanna said nobody had touched her in almost 5 years. She was still a virgin and wanted desperately not to be. Her greatest wish was to find someone at Merry Widow who would help her with this. Joanna had been sick before. As a child, she'd had leukemia. But I still weigh less now than I did then, she said, her voice a soft little tiptoe across the desk. Sister Kitty looked up from what she was writing to regard the girl before her. She had worked with cancer patients of all ages in one of her past lives, had seen the ravages of all stages of the illness. She'd caught a glimpse of ruby-red piss left behind in a toilet bowl, the scrupulousness with which nurses applied their gloves to handle the paradoxic toxins that might alleviate their patients' suffering. She'd held hands while the life went out of them, and she still found this claim very hard to believe. I was 10 when I first came here, Joanna continued. To Merry Widow? Sister Kitty was surprised. In all her time here, she'd never remembered seeing a patient that young, which always struck her as an implicit acknowledgement of the debatable value of the cures on offer here. The treatment left me incredibly weak, Joanna said. I hadn't even been outside in months. The first couple days here, I had to be pushed around in a wheelchair. My parents used to take me for walks in the evenings to watch the sunset. You ever see them out here? They're beautiful. The colors stretch out over the whole sky. She lifted her hands then, the bones in them thin and snappable as tongue depressors, looking up at the ceiling like it was made of light instead of drywall panels. Sister Kitty had always found such overwhelming sights ominous, as though something very bad had happened just out of view. But it would not be right to share such a morbid thought with this girl, so instead she said, I'm usually inside helping with the dinner service. That's too bad, Joanna said, shifting her hands back to her lap, nervously twisting their invisible origami. Well, you know what they say about a woman's work, Sister Kitty offered. No, what do they say? Sister Kitty had learned quickly to be vigilant of sarcasm, but Joanna's expression had an earnest, open glow, like she was still gazing at one of those sunsets. It's never done, Sister Kitty said. Joanna laughed, a short barking thing, like a small dog being squeezed. Is that true, do you think? In my experience, Sister Kitty said. Even your work for God? Especially for him. Well, anyway, maybe I was able to appreciate them more because it was the only time I ever got any fresh air. The medicine they were giving me, I couldn't be out during the day. It felt so good to breathe it all in, you know. Had a diamond edge to it, Joanna went on. It felt precious or something. The stuff in the mines was fine and all, but nothing compared to that. I've never been in the mines, Sister Kitty admitted. Really? Why not? It never seemed necessary, I suppose. I'd just be taking up the space of someone who wanted to be there, who paid to be there. Which seemed a nicer thing to say than she thought it was mostly bullshit. You should try it, Joanna said. It might help you with this. Then she reached out and grasped Sister Kitty's hands in hers, rubbing her thumbs over her sighing knuckles. The girl's skin felt like crepe paper, apt to tear, so Sister Kitty resisted her immediate urge to pull back, save themselves from an intimacy that seemed dangerous to them both in different ways. It wasn't that she hadn't been touched by any of the residents before. Many had drawn her into embraces on their last days, their bodies alighting gently on her limbs like a bird. But none had ever truly paid much attention to her as another being, with her own aches and pains. None until Joanna. A week later, Sister Kitty took a place beside the other robed patients. Some of them spoke to one another in low murmurs, but beyond that the only sound was the wind making its way around the mountains. 2 young men stood at the entrance to the mines, their smiles as tight as their muscles, holding up the counters for them to blow on as they filed in, wiping discreetly with a tissue after each use. Joanna hadn't told her much of what to expect, but the smell of sulfur that greeted them was thick enough to blind her. The walls were packed with dirt, hollow and arid as the inside of a nut. Bodies lounged in unexpected places. One woman sat with her hands raised as if seeking salvation. Nearby, a man bent over, exposing the fleshy knob of his scrotum. The sight of it stirred her stomach. She'd worn underwear underneath her robe, but it soon became clear she was one of the few to do so. Sister Kitty sat next to a 50-something seeming woman who had kept her sunglasses on. "What do I do?" she whispered, startling the woman out of her reverie. Even with the sunglasses, she felt this woman looked her up and down, scanning her like a barcode assessing her worth. "Just sit still and breathe," she said finally. "But how do I know when the radon starts?" "It doesn't start," the woman said, unable to keep annoyance from knifing her voice. "It's just here, in the air." "You mean all the time?" she asked, looking around as if acknowledgement would make the gas visible. "Be quiet," someone nearby hissed, and the woman shifted slightly away from her so she could absorb all the guilt sonoring toward them. A soft whooshing sound filled the room, the sound of everyone taking a breath and holding it. Sister Kitty's whole body pulsed, curling inward as if anticipating a blow. And then nothing. The people around her began unfolding like plants to the sun. She watched and waited for something similar to wash over her. She closed her eyes, stretched her legs, fanned out her fingers, tried to write the rhythm in her belly, but all that bloomed in her was boredom. Hours, or maybe minutes later, the woman next to her was shaking her shoulder and hustling her to her feet. The atmosphere had shifted again, now to something like a hatchery, hot and confined. There were 2 doors ahead, one marked for each gender. Sister Kitty hesitated a moment before following the woman inside. Steam escaped from the door, and she had to blink a few times before anything became clear. When it did, her whole body jolted like a leg being tested for reflexes. Naked women appeared to her like shapes in the clouds. Bodies like Wonder Bread. Bodies stretched tight as the string of tennis rackets. Slopes and spheres and bulbs all sloshing about. They sat up, they rolled down. Tufts of hair between legs flashed in and out of view. Heads thrown back, necks unwound. Both ashamed and ashamed for it, Sister Kitty made her way to one of the empty benches and sat down, leaned back and closed her eyes. It was all a bit like going to sleep in a sneaker, the heat drawing around her, swaddling and slightly sweet. She was just about to drift off when she felt a tugging at her waist, stealthy but insistent. She turned and saw the woman, naked except for her sunglasses, leaning over her lap and struggling to untie her robe. For a moment, Sister Kitty just stared at her, each part of her a separate threat. Breasts swinging like pendulums, the stretch marks like streaks of test paint on a wall, and down further, right above her pelvis, tipped jauntily as a hat, the tattoo of a butterfly landing on a daisy. And still coming toward her, those sunglassed eyes. "What are you doing?" she whispered. "You need to take your robe off to be in here," the woman whispered back. "Otherwise the toxins you're sweating out will get into the fabric and stay on your skin." "Toxins? What are you talking about?" "From the radon. Jesus Christ, lady." Sister Kitty soured instantly at this blasphemy, and a brief struggle ensued as she tried to fight off the hands that suddenly seemed to be everywhere, while attempting to cover up what parts of her had already been exposed. Then a grip at her elbow, pulling her up and out through the door, and then even further, out into the desert, the distant mountains swirling above her like water around a drain. "Oh, sister," said the staff member, a girl named Katrinka who had escorted her and the woman out. She wrapped the robe around her and secured it tightly, shaking her head all the while. "Thanks a fucking lot," the woman said before stalking off in the direction of the hotel. "What's with the sunglasses?" Sister Kitty asked. "She has early onset cataracts," Katrinka said. Joanna laughed when Sister Kitty recounted this to her a couple days later. "I'm sorry that happened to you," she said. "Some of the people here are mean. Did it help at least?" Sister Kitty hadn't given the matter much thought. She'd gone into the mine as a way to connect with Joanna, understand where she was coming from, what she had been through, in a way she often couldn't with her other girls. Whether it had any effect on her body was beside the point. Still, she curled her right hand into a fist, heavy and shatterable as a paperweight. This didn't seem a definitive answer. "Time will tell," she said. Joanna shrugged, less a gesture than a detachment. "Well, you could always use a tape recorder in the meantime." "Do you think that woman would have acted any different if she knew you were a nun?" "It's possible. Do you think people here treat you any differently because of your illness?" Joanna slumped slightly forward, giving her the structure of an apple's rotted core. "Sometimes I think maybe some of the other girls are jealous, because I can't really do anything to help out. I'm too weak still." "I wouldn't worry too much about that. A lot of them took a while before they started volunteering." "I'm not worried," Joanna said. "You want to know why I first started making myself throw up?" "If you want to tell me." "Because I missed it." Sister Kitty stopped writing and glanced up at Joanna, but she wasn't looking at her. She was staring at the portrait of Constance Monroe on the wall behind her. an eerie sort of half-step of attention. "You missed throwing up?" Sister Kitty repeated. She had long learned to sand down the judgmental edges of her voice, but sometimes things still took her by surprise. "That's right," Joanna said. "I've never felt more alive than when I'm doing it. With treatment, of course, you can't control it, but it's an affirmation. Your body knows what it's doing, taking over for you in those moments. What's inside will kill you otherwise." My mother would sit with me, rub that space between my shoulders. It was comforting. In the years after my remission, all I wanted was to get that safety back. "You couldn't feel safe in other ways?" "Do you remember being a 13-year-old girl? How safe did you feel?" "Fair enough," Sister Kitty said. They were both quiet for a moment, their memories spreading back across the years. Joanna had less distance to go, so she spoke sooner. "When I first came here as a kid," she said, "when they first told me about the radon in the air and stuff, how I'd absorb it, I asked them what it would absorb from me. Never got an answer on that one. Like I said, people here can be mean. I remember one time in the mines, some man came up to me and my mother, completely unprovoked. I'd never seen him before in my life. He moved like there were invisible chains on him, like a ghost out of Dickens or something. Anyway, he comes right up to us, points his finger right in my face and says, 'Bad girl, you are a bad girl.'" Joanna made the same gesture now, jabbing at the air a few times, a crooked smile dangling from her lips. "And how did that make you feel?" Sister Kitty asked. The girl's face grew very still, her smile shrinking up like a slug in salt. "Like someone had really seen me as I was for the first time," she said. "You don't really think you're bad, do you?" she wanted to say and didn't. She had seen girls like this countless times before, and very rarely she'd found there was anything you could do for them that they couldn't do themselves. This particular girl had a thumbprint-sized scar on her neck where a feeding tube had been. She had once stuck the plastic elbow of a clothes hanger down her throat during a sleepover. She had an encrypted spreadsheet on her laptop where she kept track of her daily laxative intake. She had given a lot of thought to the many ways that she could be construed as bad. So Sister Kitty kept her mouth shut, even though she sensed an anger there. A scream that was being strangled, a monstrous urge to consume the entire world and spit it back out unformed. What could be unleashed from inside her, harnessed for bringing about a powerful good? Sister Kitty wondered this, and she would keep on wondering. 4 days after this meeting, Joanna would run off with Elijah, the staff member she'd managed to convince to finally deflower her. Sister Kitty would start recording her interviews and assign the girls a position, and she would wonder every day when someone else would come along who made her feel that way. 5 years later, Mickey arrived. That's it.